Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Centre for Social Impact public seminar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're on the Noongar land and that the Noongar people remain the spiritual and cultural custodians of their land. And we know they continue to practice their values, languages, beliefs, and knowledge. So at the Centre for Social Impact, we pay our respects to the elders and also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in the room today. This workshop or this seminar is really interesting to me. I've been working in mental health for a long time, and we know the built environment is so important, but we never really have a chance to explore what that means in a practical sense. So today we have Dr. Jacinta Francis, who will talk about this and her research and PhD in this space. Jacinta is a senior research fellow at the Centre for Social Impact. She's over 20 years of health promotion and public health research experience. She explores how schools and neighbourhoods affect our mental health, bullying behaviour, sense of community, physical activity, and she looks at things like neighbourhoods and active transport. So the title of the seminar today is Safe Spaces, Sound Minds, Creating Inclusive School Environments that Enhance Perceived Safety and Improve Mental Health. I'll hand over to Jacinta in a sec. I just want you to all to know that her presentation will go for just over 30 minutes. And after that, we really, really want to invite you all to bring in your questions and comments, and we'll have, a good 20, 25 minutes to discuss together. And today everyone's online, so we'll be able to do that really nicely. So thank you, Jacinta. I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Lizette. Thanks for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone online for joining me today. If you just bear with me, I'll start to share my screen. And all right. So I'm going to present some of the findings from my Healthway funded research fellowship, which was comprised of a number of projects conducted over a 3 to 4 year period that fell under the banner of the Building Out Bullying project. Now, this project addressed how school environments impact students' bullying behaviour, perceived safety and mental health. And when discussing school environments today, I will be focusing predominantly on the built or physical environment. I'd also like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I am presenting, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge my partner organisations and my wonderful team of staff, students and volunteers who helped me deliver the Building Out Bullying project. So over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to begin by briefly telling you about my career trajectory and what led me to the research we're discussing today. I'll provide the background or the rationale for investigating school-built environments and their impact on health outcomes. I'll touch very briefly on the methodology, just to explain how we came up with the research findings. And I'll spend most of my time discussing these findings, specifically features of the school-built environment that help to prevent bullying behaviour, optimise safety and promote mental health. Towards the end of that discussion, I'll also present work that I've done on all gender toilets in Western Australian schools, and I'll finish with a summary of what I've discussed and the resources that we have available. So a little bit about me. I spent my school years living in Heathridge, which is one of Perth's northern suburbs. These days it's surrounded by other suburbs, but back in the 80s it was on the urban fringe. So there weren't a lot of walkable destinations, very few trees, and predominantly single detached houses and a lot of young families. I drew on this experience of growing up in a new residential development when I commenced my PhD. As Lizette said, I have a background in public health and health promotion, and one of my earliest research roles was with Professor Billy Giles Courteye on a project exploring the impact of urban design on walking, cycling, use of public transport, and sense of community in these new residential developments. And my PhD project expanded on Billy's work to explore associations between between public space and mental health in these new residential developments. Now, from a mental health perspective, we found that the quality of public space is just as important and sometimes more important than the quantity of public space within a neighbourhood. And after adjusting for other influential factors such as socioeconomic status, we found that people who lived in neighbourhoods containing high quality parks had better mental health than those living in areas with low quality parks. We also found that high quality parks and high quality retail areas were associated with a greater sense of community. So these days, the association between contact with nature and mental health is well established, but back in the early 2000s, there were relatively few papers providing empirical evidence of this relationship. Now, during my PhD, I did touch on schools as a quasi-public space, but I wanted to explore schools further and apply the lessons I've learnt in the neighbourhood to the school setting. And so I've predominantly conducted school-based research for the past 10 years. Sorry, I've jumped ahead. So in terms of the background for this area of research, the published literature has demonstrated that lack of perceived safety is the strongest predictor of mental health difficulties in adolescents. And we know that bullying or peer victimisation is one of the most common causes of feeling unsafe at school. Now, bullying is the repeated intentional harm of a person who has less power than the aggressor. So it's not the occasional fight or disagreement between peers. Now, why is bullying problematic? It's a major public health issue linked to a range of physical and mental health problems, including anxiety and depression, suicide, and poor academic performance. In Australia, the economic cost of bullying in schools is about $2.3 billion for each school year group. And this amount includes costs incurred during the student's entire schooling career, as well as up to 20 years after school completion. And Australian studies have shown that about 1 in 6 students aged 7 to 17 years are bullied at least once a week. Now, effective anti-bullying interventions are often whole school initiatives comprised of multiple program components, such as changes to school policies, to classroom rules, to curriculum and parent engagement. However, the effectiveness of many school-based anti-bullying interventions has been mixed and modest. So many interventions cease to be effective after about grade 9, and in some instances, they can inadvertently increase bullying behaviour. So one could therefore argue that new approaches to prevent bullying are needed. Now, the built environment is a relatively new area of research within the bullying literature. There's no consensus definition of the built environment, but it's often described as all buildings, spaces, and objects that are created or modified by people. And it's recognised as an essential component of health promoting schools. So with the Building Out Bullying project, we set out to explore how the school built social and policy environments influence the bullying behaviour and mental health of both primary and secondary school students in Western Australia. We conducted a systematic scoping review. We looked at over 7,500 articles exploring the school built environment and bullying. And we also conducted 70 interviews with policymakers and practitioners, school staff, students, and parents. And these interviews covered bullying behaviour, but also perceived safety and mental health. Now, we found that study participants rarely linked the school built environment directly to bullying behaviour. For the most part, the built environment was linked indirectly to bullying via 3 main pathways. So the first pathway included visibility and supervision. The second looked at the student's physical and psychological comfort, and the third included social and emotion regulation. And I'll explore these pathways over the next few slides. So looking at the first pathway, visibility and supervision, built environmental factors that obstruct visibility, such as in toilets and locker rooms, prevented other students and teachers from seeing and intervening when a bullying incident occurs. Participants were also conscious of optimising visibility. So, for example, some architects spoke of designing teachers' preparation areas in high schools with transparent walls and in the middle of active student hubs, noting that even if the teachers aren't there, because the hub is there, students act differently. In addition to windows and lighting, other built environmental factors influencing visibility included school and building design, such as pathways and wayfinding. And as one person noted, clarity of order is really important. Knowing you're going in the right direction makes you more confident. And they also noted that that the people doing the bullying have less time to bully and less opportunity to bully. Population density or crowding was another factor influencing visibility. As one practitioner stated, what you don't want is a big conglomeration of 200 lockers in one small room because it elevates the risk for some bullying, and it's harder to supervise because the lockers themselves block sight lines. Now, the second mechanism through which the school built environment may impact bullying is by affecting students' physical or psychological comfort. This was reflected in a quote about noise or acoustics, with one participant hypothesising that the impact of noise and physical discomfort on bullying works in two ways. If you're the person being bullied, you're already nervous in that space, the bullying might affect you more because you're not feeling safe. If you're the person doing the bullying, you might be grumpy from the noise and discomfort, and bullying is what you use to relieve or express it. Now, ventilation and temperature were also said to influence comfort levels, and this second quote is about the cold and sometimes grey undercover areas, and that children often have to sit and eat their food on the cold floor, and that they tend to see the children getting restless and starting to pick on each other. Now, aesthetics, vandalism and maintenance, so the appearance of the school was also mentioned. For example, there were some schools where the upkeep was so poor that the kids saw no value for the school and also no value then in the children attending it. And if the culture is one of neglect of the school, then it's one of neglect of the students as well. And some of you may be familiar with the broken windows theory, which states that visible signs of crime and antisocial behaviour in the neighbourhood can create an environment that encourages further crime and disorder. Other factors included furniture and seating. So again, here's a quote from a policymaker stating that the power of a chair cannot be understated, and people often arrange gardens so that they're aesthetically pretty rather than thinking about the social dynamics of the space. Straight line walls are terrible because that encourages all the kids to sit on a wall and judge those going by, whereas a curved wall encourages conversation and more children are welcomed in. And here are some before and after images of two different schools demonstrating the difference that improving aesthetics and seating can potentially make to how the space feels and how people interact within it. Now, the final pathway through which the built environment may influence bullying is by providing opportunities for social and emotional regulation and the development of skills that might prevent bullying between students, such as managing boredom, exclusion, and conflict. Collaborative workspaces and classrooms that have different zones to accommodate different needs, as well as small and large groups of children, may help students develop pro-social skills and behaviours that potentially prevent bullying. A lack of activities or equipment during break times was also linked to boredom and in turn bullying. As one parent noted, students that feel left out are the ones that are either going to be picked on because they're not doing anything, or they're going to be the ones that are trying to get in and cause those issues in the first place. And they really felt that preventing bullying was having things to keep the students occupied. The absence of inclusive environments or facilities that reflect an acceptance of marginalised groups was also seen to influence bullying. So these groups might include students who are LGBTQ+, students living with disabilities or living in poverty, or members of ethnic or religious minority groups. And as one person said in relation to the LGBTQ+ community, there's this development of male toilets, female toilets, and then unisex toilets, and they emphasise the importance of providing students with choice. And then participants also recognised that quiet spaces for reflection and mood regulation were needed. So again, as one participant stated, Places need to teach children how to regulate their emotions. So children who get really angry really quickly are often children who have been victimised themselves. And sometimes these self-soothing rooms and reflection rooms are fabulous for children who are reactive bullying or bullying victims. And I'll explore this concept of safe spaces within schools over the next few slides. So in the United States, the increasing number of school shootings has led to the implementation of physical security measures in schools, such as metal detectors, surveillance cameras, security guards, and perimeter fencing. And even in Australia, a number of schools are surrounded by high perimeter fencing, and the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has increased the emphasis that schools are placing on the built environment and visibility. There is research, however, that suggests that excessive security measures can negatively impact perceived safety, as well as students' academic achievement and psychosocial functioning. And we know that connected and welcoming school environments are often perceived by students as safer. So schools really need to be designed in such a way that balances student and staff physical safety with their psychological well-being. Now, safe spaces in schools that were identified by our study participants included school libraries, existing classrooms, purpose-built rooms such as wellness rooms, and outdoor areas that provide privacy while still allowing students to see what is happening on the playground. So looking at the first of these spaces, libraries, they were the most common safe spaces identified by study participants. And this was largely attributed to the presence of staff who can supervise the students and the fact that the students had the option of either being alone or spending time with others. Classrooms also emerged as safe spaces, so it could be that the corner of a classroom has been set up as a quiet area, or something like this, the image on this slide, where pods are being built into classrooms, and these are for students to sort of reflect on their schoolwork or equally manage their emotions and spend some time alone. And as one teacher noted, they often contain couches, books, and soft materials, so the teachers can set them up in any way they please. In some high schools, students were allowed to spend time in classrooms during break time, such as the art room. However, one educational expert I spoke to did caution against the use of computer rooms. From a bullying perspective, the rooms need to contain activities where the children are relating to each other. So it's critical that there aren't computers because the lonely children will sit in front of a computer and never build their social skills. They suggested board games, but ultimately these spaces need to facilitate relationship building because children are less likely to be bullied or targeted if they've got friends. And then harking back to my PhD days, there was a recognition that children tend to be calmer in nature and that outdoor spaces that afford children a sense of privacy while still allowing them to see what's happening in the playground um, may be considered safe spaces. So many participants emphasised the importance of feeling like their back is safe and that the area isn't too big for the size of the group that they were in. And then the fourth and final space identified as safe spaces were wellness rooms. So sometimes they're called comfort rooms or sensory rooms, and these are increasingly common in Western Australian schools. So this study participant talked about a room, they called it a breathe easy room at their previous school. They mentioned that it was filled with bean bags and soft lighting, there were no hard edges, and it was supervised by a kind, gentle teacher. So the purpose of the room was to help the child to learn to soothe themselves, and it was generally used for children who were misbehaving, but it was taking them into a place that was by its design dictating the kinds of behaviours that children should be thinking about. And then when that child felt suitably calm, they were allowed to go out and join the group again. The teacher that supervised that space would also sometimes do activities with the child, so deep breathing and mindfulness. So it wasn't writing lines, it was learning how to regulate their emotions. And as this person noted, all schools have children who can't regulate their behaviour. These rooms aren't just for children who are misbehaving, they also need to be available to children who just need some quiet time. And some parents who I spoke to also suggested that these rooms should include equipment like weighted blankets and sensory fidget toys for those neurodivergent students. Now, the previous quote also reflects a quote from a 12-year-old child that I spoke to who described a hypothetical safe space when I asked what they would include in a safe space. But again, it touches on everything mentioned before. So we're looking at couches and soft furnishings, carpets, dim lighting, music. They wanted stuffed animals to hug and talk to so they felt like someone was listening. And they also suggested having a staff member nearby, but only in the room for part of the time so they could spend some time on their own. But as you're probably gathering, the recurring features of these wellness rooms included things such as soft music, comfortable seating and furniture, adequate equipment and activities, images and colours inspired by nature, supportive staff members, and co-locating the rooms with other services to enhance privacy. So the reason for this co-location was so that it wasn't immediately apparent that students were seeking help or support. One participant gave the example of a school that had a big open space containing beanbags, books, Wi-Fi access, and the offices for the psychologist and the nurse and the year coordinators were off that space. And this also meant that the psychologist could wander out and just touch base with the students on a more informal basis. They did note, however, that if it's right up where the admin building is, the kids aren't going to go there because they don't want to feel like they're in trouble. So it's important that it's somewhere like the library that's quite centrally located. Now, another way in which schools can create safe spaces and be more inclusive is to provide access to all gender toilets. So school toilets have been identified as the least safe spaces for LGBTQ+ students in schools. And they're especially hostile for trans and gender diverse students. There have been reported sites of verbal, physical, and sexual assault. Now, bullying in school toilets can impact school attendance as well as academic performance, psychological well-being, and it's also been linked to substance abuse, and toilet avoidance can result in a range of health problems. So introducing all gender toilets in schools may be a strategy to prevent bullying and the assault of LGBTQ+ students. Now, all gender toilets are accessible to all students, regardless of their gender identity. Some configurations allow students to occupy a shared space, so you've got your more traditional cubicles, while others are single, self-contained spaces with a toilet and hand basin. So these are images of self-contained school toilets in South Australia. I'm aware that we have a national audience. All gender toilets have been incorporated into many new schools in other states of Australia, but they're far less common in Western Australian schools. In some schools, the toilet contains a basin, such as the image on the left. In other schools, the basin is in the corridor and exposed to passing foot traffic. And you can see from these schools in Adelaide that the signs may be different, but they still indicate that they're available to all students. What we do want to avoid, however, is this configuration where the lockers are blocking sight lines and no one can see who is entering the toilets. So this school chose to create their own sex segregated toilets despite unisex toilets being incorporated into the original design. And this was because some students were using the same self-contained toilet at the same time. I've heard this reported at a few schools where they're seeing sexual activity taking place in the toilets. There's vaping, there's TikTok videos being filmed. Some children are eating lunch in the toilets. So these clear sight lines, once again, are very important. Now, at the time of publication, our study appeared to be the first in the published literature exploring factors influencing the inclusion of all gender toilets in Australian schools. Our findings reinforce the published literature around toilets and bullying and found school toilets were potential bullying hotspots for trans and gender diverse students, and that school staff were receiving increasing numbers of requests for all gender toilets. While there was widespread support for all gender toilets amongst our study sample, the group did acknowledge and discuss some of the barriers to including all gender toilets in schools. Now, some of the biggest barriers were financial and spatial costs. Those self-contained toilets in particular take up more space and can be more expensive to build. There was also a recognition that it's not always culturally appropriate to mix genders in the same space. Some school staff also noted resistance from parents and some students, particularly in primary schools. Although I will note that in Western Australia, most kindergartens contain all gender toilets, although they aren't signed as such, and this only changes once they start primary school. There were also privacy and confidentiality concerns, with one participant noting that trans students weren't disclosing bullying behaviour because it might lead to a disclosure about their gender identity, which would stigmatise them or make them more of a subject of bullying. And then there were code compliance issues around gender neutral toilets, because under the National Construction Code, there are stipulated numbers of female, disabled or male toilets, but it doesn't accommodate non-gender. And there are efforts and campaigns to try and change the National Construction Code, future intervention studies exploring the impact of all gender toilets on all students may strengthen these efforts. So in summary, I'd like to reinforce that the finding that most built environmental factors were indirectly linked to bullying illustrates this interrelationship between individuals and their built social and socio-cultural environments. So the specific built environmental features of a bullying location need to be considered in conjunction with how these locations are used, as well as the social interactions and school policies or rules surrounding their use. We also need to educate our staff and students. A lot of the quotes I presented today were from policymakers and practitioners, many of whom were school architects who had an existing awareness of how the school built environment impacts bullying behaviour. But by contrast, a lot of the students I spoke to had never considered this potential relationship. So one strategy to reduce bullying may be to educate students so they have knowledge and skills to support one another, even if it's just pulling up a chair to accommodate another student. We also need to educate our staff. So classrooms are often designed with a particular function or purpose in mind, but this information isn't always passed on to new staff over time. So for example, classrooms may be built with windows overlooking playgrounds to increase that natural surveillance, but then a new teacher might come along and stick some artwork on those windows, which then blocks the visibility. Regarding safe spaces, schools need to balance this need for physical safety with psychological safety and the creation of welcoming environments. And regarding all gender toilets, schools need to provide students with a range of toilet designs and access options. Now, I acknowledge that building new schools and refurbishing old ones can be expensive, so we may want to prioritise budget allocation based on those schools with maintenance and repair needs, with significant histories of violence or behavioural problems, higher rates of property crime, and population risk factors such as low socioeconomic status. At the end of the day, though, altering the built environment is a potentially cost-effective strategy to support or complement existing bullying prevention efforts and improve the mental health in both primary and secondary school students. It is a population-level health intervention, and it has the potential to benefit thousands of students and staff in any given year. That's the end of my main presentation. I'll quickly run through some resources that may be of interest to you. If you're wanting more information about any of the research I've presented, we do have a number of publications. So this is our scoping review. We have our papers exploring the pathways linking the built environment to bullying and the work we published around gender or gender toilets. Our paper on safe spaces is still under review. I didn't touch on these papers today, but they were led by my honour student, Emily Ghizzarelli. Emily, I think I saw you join this meeting, and she explored school staff responses to students' reports of bullying behaviour. We also produced a built environment checklist for school staff to help prevent bullying behaviour and promote student wellbeing. And you can see that the three potential pathways I mentioned earlier form the subheadings in the checklist. We've referenced the need for safe spaces or quiet spaces throughout the school and all gender toilets. I also wanted to reinforce that interest in how the built environment impacts bullying behaviour has been growing in recent years. So our scoping review was the first review paper published in peer-reviewed journals linking the school built environment to bullying behaviour. I'm also part of an international working group exploring school design and safety, particularly in relation to migrant students. We were fortunate to meet in Paris a couple of years ago, where I provided the keynote address at the UNESCO headquarters. So again, a lot of interest has been generated, and we do have a grant that UNESCO is reviewing to explore school design internationally. We also recently collaborated on a book that will be published later this year. More locally in Australia, we have Learning Environments Australasia, which is our peak body advocating for innovative learning environments. Our Jedi workshop about designing inclusive schools is on the 22nd of March. And I have a list of references, but feel free to contact me if you want any of these references or more information. That's effectively all from me. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen and then I'll hand back to Lizette. So again, please bear with me.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. That was excellent and so informative, especially a topic like bullying and the whole social dynamics among students and cohorts is so complex. So it's really interesting to come at this from just a very pragmatic, and concrete, literally, point of view, and to sort of see that people are studying the impacts of it. So that is really brilliant. So now we've got time. It'd be great to open up the room and the conversation. Jacinta has been studying this for years, so she, can sort of expand on any of the points she's made and answer any specific questions. So does anyone have a comment or a question? You can raise your hand or just jump in. Mariana.
Mariana's microphone's muted.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jacinta. That's really fascinating. I'm curious about the inclusion of animals or plants. How there's research to say that animals can be very calming for students, and also the ability to do gardening or to learn about how plants and how to grow plants. Did you have any evidence around that, and how might schools accommodate that? Is that something you looked at?
We didn't really explore it in any detail, Mariana, but we did encounter a few schools that had therapy dogs. So these were often in the library, or they would be, or they would belong to one of the school counsellors or psychologists, and they would often just be there to interact with the students during break times, or if they were needing support. So I think there is that awareness within the school community of how beneficial animals can be. In terms of gardens and planting, again, I'm aware that some schools do have gardening programs, but it wasn't something that we explored. But certainly there's lots of literature, including our own, linking that contact with nature with better mental health and wellbeing.
And I see there's a question from David. David, do you want to verbally ask the question?
Can do, yeah, it's a short one. Just wondering if there's any link between bullying prevalence and socioeconomic status, if you looked at that.
Yeah, so looking at school level socioeconomic status, there is some evidence that schools with low SES experience more bullying than medium and high SES schools. And the authors of the paper that I'm referring to felt that it may be because these schools in low SES areas had less resources, and therefore they were prioritising I guess, more tangible school factors and educational outcomes over and above bullying prevention or wellbeing programs. Similarly, higher SES schools may be better resourced and so more able to promote that more engaged learning environment. But bullying perpetration occurs across all socioeconomic areas. There weren't many There were rather many accounts of bullying behaviour in the high SES schools that I visited, and I think the overall conclusion in most papers is that all schools require bullying prevention efforts.
Thank you. Karina has put a question in the chat. I don't know if Karina is around to ask it, or oh, there she is. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, our local government has a lot of shared school sites with the education department, and we often find that they've got such fixed guidelines that when we're trying to have design conversations, it's a bit like, moving the Queen Mary. Has this study been promulgated through their design teams, and how have you found it received in regard to changing their design briefs?
We haven't worked with any local governments as part of this project. I mean, certainly the work that I was doing in my PhD, we often talked about how the school ovals should be used by the community. So you've got that shared use of the parks and local areas. That's certainly the ideal. I think the inclusion of these perimeter fencing around schools is really impacting sense of community within an area. I mean, just from personal experience, I know that at my local school, all of the local community members tend to congregate there after school and even on weekends, and our principal has been supportive of that. But I can't comment more generally, Karina, sorry.
While we wait for the next questions, Jacinta, I was wondering, I saw in your methodology you looked at separate age categories of students, and I just wondered if you found, was there much difference across the age groups in terms of their needs?
I mean, I guess the obvious difference is that primary schools, the students tend to remain in the same classroom for the majority of their time, whereas high schools, they're constantly moving from school to school. Actually, the biggest difference might have been around staff mental health and wellbeing, because particularly with these new design features, which are fantastic for students' mental health. So, for example, having these windows as opposed to brick walls, and having these preparation areas for the teachers more centrally located, it means that they can see and intervene if a bullying incident is occurring, but it also means that the teachers are more available to students, that they may also be, constantly interrupted. They may not have their own safe spaces that they can retreat to if they need a quiet moment. And so one thing that we really want to explore is what impact some of these new design features are having on staff mental health.
Interesting.
I've got another question, if it's allowed.
Go for it.
It's around, Jacinta, I noticed that you did some of the research around the COVID period in 2020. And did you see anything related to the incidence of bullying, or did you hear that there was a change in bullying behavior during COVID? And were there any implications for the built environment and for the way in which schools are designed?
Yeah, we started our data collection in 2020. I think the biggest influence of COVID on our study was just in getting approval to enter the school sites, because a lot of schools were prioritising those educational outcomes and spending less time on the research. Fortunately, in WA, the schools only closed down for a total of 3 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. So we were very fortunate compared to some of the other states in Australia. We didn't look at whether bullying increased or decreased during that period. As I said, we weren't as affected. I guess in terms of COVID, there was a much bigger emphasis on ventilation in the schools and also crowd control. So I know that some schools implemented staggered break times, so they didn't have all of the children out on the equipment or in the canteen area at the same time. And I know that there were some reports that lots of the school staff actually really liked those staggered break times, and we're hoping that it would continue post-COVID.
Oh,
Yeah, just going beyond the research itself, but and then thinking about take up in terms of policy, practice, and impact. To what extent, because you've got bullying and you've got the built environment. So therefore, when you think about policy and practice and impact, you're looking at, yes, Department of Education, independent schools, and then you're talking about architects and builders and the like. So how is that interaction occurring, in terms of taking on the research and having an impact on how architects are thinking about their design, and builders, and have you seen any resistance or alternatively really positive take up?
Yeah, so earlier in my presentation, I showed all of my partners, and they include the Department of Education, Catholic Education WA, the Association of Independent Schools, and then also we had Parry and Rosenthal architects and some other architects. So we were all working on this project together. The idea is that some of these findings will inform revisions of the state government's primary school brief and secondary school planning guide, which is effectively the blueprint that is used for all government schools in Western Australia. We've certainly had a lot of support from them. We've also developed that built environment checklist, which is more for school staff as opposed to the architects and policymakers, and that includes more minor changes to the built environment that sort of falls within the remit of principals, so that schools can start making the changes that are available to them. So we're trying to work with those more on the ground, as well as those decision makers at the top. And fortunately, we've had some really great support.
So there's a few comments in the chat. Mariana, did you want to? You're talking about good design. Okay, so everyone can see that, yep, doesn't need to be expensive. And then there's a comment from Karina about, Karina, did you want to elaborate? Just trying to read.
Yeah, just saying that when we deal with architects, you say, look, we'd like to put in all gender toilets in our design brief, and they're really up with how to do that workaround with regards to the National Construction Code. And some even large architectural firms are just, no idea, and you kind of, have to send them on the path to say, yes, it is possible. And then they go away and do some research and come back. And then we get councillor resistance.
Yeah, it is really tricky, I think, with that resistance. I mean, there have been some community studies where we've looked at public toilets, not me personally, they've been published, and they've found there's been no difference in terms of any sort of assaults or crimes, which is often one of the barriers or oppositions to having all gender toilets, but there's actually no evidence to suggest that those rates of assaults are increasing once you include all gender toilets. And I think the bigger issue is the slides that I showed linking toilet avoidance, particularly in schools, with all of these health related problems, the increased rates of bullying and the effects on mental health.
Thank you for that. So Teddy, I see you have a comment about the inverse effect, and would you like to ask Jacinta?
Yes, sure, and especially following on from this chat about evidence around assaults in bathrooms, because I don't know whether evidence matters to the people who are against gender neutral toilets in most forms. I can absolutely foresee that it has the inverse effect, that students accessing something like an all-gender toilet or a sensory space makes them a target. I can certainly speak to my stepson who's just started high school, feeling extremely self-conscious about needing to use some of the support needs that will make his time better. I'm sure you already touched on that kind of emerging in the research, but what are some of the ways that we can balance or mitigate that risk?
You mean about them being identified in the school as using these spaces, and therefore
sort of outing themselves essentially as a queer person or a neurodivergent person?
Yes, I mean, I think, as I said, the co-location, if we're talking about safe spaces and wellness rooms, the co-location with other services, so it's not as apparent why someone is walking into a particular building or seeking assistance in some way is really important. In terms of the all-gender toilets, it's really important that they are centrally located and not on the perimeters of the school, because that can be quite unsafe for some students. And again, it's about providing options so that they're not so uncommon that it's unusual to see someone entering a unisex or gender toilet. And I think it's important that they are different to some of the other, toilets that might be in that space, particularly those targeting or available to children with disabilities, because my research has shown that some gender diverse students don't want to be associated with having a disability, and so I think it's important to be respectful of that as well.
Thanks for that. Does anyone have any further questions, comments, or experiences? Karina has put a comment, thank you. Karina, I don't know if you want to talk to it, talking about school breakfast programs. Yeah, again, so not making them sort of segregated places for certain people, but just normalized spaces where people can access it without feeling stigmatized. Yes. Okay, so any further questions? Jacinta, is there anything that you want to finish on that you didn't cover today that you think you wanted to make the point?
No, I think we've covered everything. I think at the end of the day, we just need to provide students with options and ensure that we've got a range of design features, a range of activities, and that we're catering to children with different needs and different interests within schools.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all who attended for your attention and time today and for the discussion.